Good morning, PSAC kids. It is Wednesday morning, October 11th. This is our lecture for today on the Arctic Confederation, and so once I take attendance, we'll be able to get started with you guys. So just hang tight for a little bit, and then your lecture will get started.
Okay, I studied the DB2 yesterday, and I was really confused. And I was wondering if you could help me. Because I worked a long time on it, and all I got was an intro paragraph. I guess I don't I thought yeah, so you talk about John
into their own different colonies. So all of that stuff will together to explain their differences. But then they grow in that shows similarities.
Wait here. Okay. What? How? No, don't tell. Weird to watch. Okay, I
remember the categories I gave you. Talk about multiple things. I lied. I did have a Band-Aid, and it looks like they've been used up by my sub. Do you want to go get some, or are you going to be okay?
I just wrote down when John Adams to the shop when
All right. So, we're going to get started. You've got a good chunk of your class missing right now because they are taking the PSAT. We are going to be recording the presentation from today, though, so you'll be able to see this lecture tonight if it's something that you want to watch later on. And so for us, what we'll be doing then is we'll be working our way through Chapter 9 today, taking a look at the Articles of Confederation. So you should make sure your notes are out so we can be able to work through that. Tomorrow, then, we'll be taking a look at the Articles and how they transition into the Constitution. It's going to be taking a look at two different governmental styles that we try out inside of our country. And so we'll be learning about the two different viewpoints on how we should be governed. And hopefully by tomorrow, we should be largely through Chapter 9 with the basic material, and then we'll be actually reading through the Constitution later on this week to take a look at structurally what's happening inside of there, because it becomes the foundation for not just our U.S. history class, but also foundationally, it's really the only thing that's protecting you from a dictatorship coming in and taking away a lot of your rights. And so it very much sets up the idea of having a government that has checks and balances, separation of powers, and other sorts of protections to keep you safe. So when we finish up with school, we really want to be able to talk not just generally about the Constitution, but specifically what guarantees they're providing. Before we get started today, do you guys have any questions or problems you need help with before we get rolling? Good. Tonight, remember then, you've got an assignment where I want you to have your DBQ typed as a Google document by tomorrow when you come to class, so you can do some peer editing with that and discuss with one another what you're learning about the DBQ. I've already had a number of conversations with people who have had questions about the DBQ, experiencing frustrations with the DBQ. That's all legit. But I still want you to see the entire process through so you're able to do your writing and be good. Hi.
I'm trying to retake the test,
Yeah.
but nothing is loading.
Oh.
Like I'm connected to the Wi-Fi and stuff.
Uh-huh.
Whenever I get to the test screen, I start it and then it's completely white.
Are you doing it through the lockdown screen or are you doing it through your own login?
I'm doing it through the Wi-Fi.
Do it through your own login instead. Okay. So let's get started with the Articles of Confederation today. And what we will want to do is we're going to want to dial that into your political spectrum. What? Oh, yeah, I haven't figured out how I can get rid of the picture right there because it's going to be not useful in just a second. So I liked when it was gone. Oh, okay. So we're going to start off with the political spectrum. We're going to be taking a look at the 1770s political spectrum. Yeah.
Should we redraw it or if we already have it drawn from
I would draw a new one.
Because you're adding
The reason why I wanted to redraw it, the question was really a good one, because for us, the key thing we want to understand is the political spectrum will change over time. What is status quo now will not remain status quo 40 to 50 years from now. It's probably going to be seen as a more conservative viewpoint when we move into the future. So if you hear somebody say the kids nowadays are doing blah, blah, blah in a condescending sort of way, it's usually because they've got a more conservative viewpoint because they're trying to hold on to the old ways of doing things, and you guys are making change happen. So for the liberal side, that's where we got our new ideas popping up. For us, though, there's a problem that we need to be aware of. If you try to learn the political spectrum, hi, you have a pass. Oh, are you okay?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, you're just 5 minutes late. When we take a look at the political spectrum, it is changing over time. And when we think about the change over time that we're seeing, we learned about these two spots on the political spectrum. The spot to the right of the political spectrum is known as what position? It's conservative. Now that term is used quite a bit nowadays when talking about Republicans. But what we need to think about as conservative and liberal back in the old days, so here's our liberal, is the idea that for many of the revolutionaries, they're fighting against the status quo of the time period, and the status quo that they're battling against is monarchy. So what it meant to be liberal back in the 1700s is very much not what it means to be a liberal now. So this is classical liberalism that I'll be teaching you about that you're going to learn more about when you take world history next year. So classical liberalism is the idea that you want to create a government that has freedom, a small government that's less intrusive. And when I mention those sorts of characteristics, that sounds very much like the model for what the Republican Party is nowadays. But that's what we call classical liberalism during this time period, where this is the things that they want to do differently than what the conservatives are up to. Now, you notice my shorthand. When I'm taking notes, when I'm brainstorming or whatever, I'm never going to write out government because it's a lot of wasted letters. So that's G-O-V''T. So when you see that, that's just my abbreviation for government, and it saves me some time with my writing. And so figure out a shorthand for yourself that does the same so you can take notes quickly to help yourself out. For the Americans, when the war is going on, they have to figure out a way to govern themselves. And so Chapter 9 is setting up a foundational idea for the next year that we'll be studying. So from now until the end of our course, the chapter we're studying currently is going to be the battle lines for why Republicans and Democrats can't get along, why the North and the South can't get along during the Civil War, because they have very different visions on what our government should be. And for many people in America, they like to believe that the Founding Fathers all agreed on everything and that they were united on their visions. But the problem is, when the monarchy was in place, the colonies had to figure out how to govern themselves during the Revolution. They behaved very much like a friend of mine that I had in high school, who was very much a straight-laced, straight-A student who had a very repressive family who wouldn't let him have the freedoms that he wanted to have. And so he had an early curfew, didn't have the opportunity to go out the way that the rest of us did. And so after being under the heels of that, when he went off to college, he didn't just become a liberal, he became a radical. My friend went off the deep end, started drinking alcohol, started doing other substances, skipping classes, doing all the stuff he wasn't allowed to do when he was with his parents because he was rebelling. In the case of the Americans, they're going to try this out too, and what they're going to do is they're going to create a government called the Articles of Confederation. Now, when we look at that term, confederation, that is an incredibly valuable term to hold on to, because when we think about a confederation, a confederacy, con means anti. So this is an anti-federal government. This is not a federal government where you have a strong central government. This is instead having a very weak central government. And a confederation is just a loose assembly of people for a given purpose. When you see the Articles of Confederation, it's very much modeled after what Ben Franklin's Albany Congress was about when he tried to develop this defense plan to fight back against the Indians and the French during the French and Indian War. When we look at the Articles of Confederation, though, it's going to create a very weak government. It will not have the power to tax. It will not have the power to create a military. It will not have the power to enforce any of its laws. And so as a result, it can give recommendations during the war. And a lot of Americans are okay with the Articles because then they don't have to worry about a dictatorship emerging during the Revolutionary War, where don't want to replace one monarch with another dictator. Go ahead.
So the last political spectrum we wrote was like during the war and this is after the war?
This is running through the war and into the period afterwards. So this is, when you see the Articles, this is the government they create during the war. They describe it for you, being debated in the 1770s, created in 1781. And it's an incredibly bad form of government when you're trying to do anything as an organized force. They can give recommendations, but they have no power. And when you look at the Articles right here, this is going to give tons of power to the states, which is the reason why I wanted to highlight this term. When we get to the Civil War, it's not an accident that the South will call itself the Confederacy. They are trying to go back during the Civil War to what we originally had during the Revolution, which is an incredibly weak central government. States had all the power, and when we get to the Civil War, the South wants to have states' rights, especially with what issue? Exactly. And so that's what you want to link together with Chapter 9, because Chapter 9, and later on to the Civil War, this is what the South really wants to hold on to. This is going to go badly, kind of like my friend in college who was about to be expelled for all the misbehavior he was into. And so when you read Chapter 9,
he's going to find out that he doesn't want to go back to the old days of what he had with his parents, but he can't keep living like this because things are disintegrating. And so we're going to find the country is going to do the same thing that my friend did. They're going to try and find a middle ground. So we're going to create the Constitution, which is going to be less radical than the Articles of Confederation in how much power it's going to give to the states, but it's still going to have a bunch of radical ideas in it, like checks and powers, separation of balances, and all these other things that make the government what it was. For us, though, when we think about the American Revolution, then, it's a legitimate question to ask, was the Revolution a radical war, or was it more of a conservative conflict? And what we see is initially, we go with a very radical style of government, but then eventually we back it off, realizing that there were some benefits to having a strong central government, especially being able to take care of issues like debts and defense and those sorts of things. Does that make sense? Cool. So with the three types of governments I just laid out for you, since it's early and warm in here, I've got the fans turned off so they don't mess with the microphones. Make sure you're still awake. Share with your neighbors what I just explained about the three different types of governments we experienced at first. Make sure you're clear, and then we'll move on. All right, let's get rolling. So, when you go to Washington, D.C., if you ever go to the National Archives, if you ever see the movie National Treasure, they have... Okay, there is in Washington, D.C., in our National Archives, they've got bomb-proof glass that is meant to protect our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. Flame. And so we'll take that archive. And so what we'll find, though, is the Articles of Confederation are kind of in the trash bin of history. When I went to see the National Archives, I asked where those were. They got on the walkie-talkies, called to somebody else, and found out that they're in a warehouse still under storage so that they're not going to get destroyed. But they're seen as kind of a negative aspect of our history rather than a proud moment of our history. When you guys read about Valley Forge and how Washington didn't have supplies or money or any organization, it's because they built a government that is incredibly too weak to be able to pull off what they need to during the war. The reason why Washington's seen as such a great guy, because of the fact that he's able to overcome not just the British, but also the failures of the American people to help support him during the war. So a lot of Americans in the Articles of Confederation build a government that is so thoroughly weak that they can get nothing done. The states themselves then, during a confederacy, each state's operating like its own mini-nation. And then in the Articles, it's more like an advisory board where you get together and discuss stuff, but you can't really compel anybody to do anything against their will. The states have all the power. The problem then with this is this government's going to get set up during the American Revolution, and it's going to be our wartime government providing a little bit of organization to try to help out with the war effort. There's problems, though, because there's a lot of jealousy between the colonies. If you remember, the only thing during the Revolution that was really uniting the colonists was their hatred of whom? King George III. And so for us, when we take a look at what's happening then, we've got a problem going on with the Articles of Confederation, where we're trying to use this government that's incredibly weak, that's giving the states all the power, but it's also trying to do things organizationally to help win a war, but they've also got logistical stuff to deal with, like what do we do with the areas out west? So when we look at the Articles, there's going to be very limited accomplishments that they have, and we're going to just take a look at a few of them today. So first of all, this map is key for you to understand. This map is showing you the claims that were created by the king when he created our colonies. And what I want you to notice when you're studying the colonies, chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, is we went from having proprietorships to all of these different royal colonies, but they were started at different times by different kings, by different companies, with different religions, with different time frames. And so some of the colony groupings that you'll see happening here are going to be ones that don't have any sort of Western claims,
And so you'll see places like New York not really having a lot of opportunities out here, but for Virginia, they cleaned up during the colonial time. So instead of having a north, south, east, and west border like you've got with New York, you've instead got Virginia that's got a north and south border. They border the Chesapeake, but then they get all the way out to the Appalachians. They get modern-day Kentucky. They get modern-day Illinois. They've got Ohio. They've got all of this area up in Wisconsin. And Virginia has the idea of keeping it. So they want to become like these super colony that everybody else has to look up to. But they've got a problem. This is before cell phones. This is before trains. This is before even telegraph. So the idea that they're going to govern this area that's west of what mountain range? The idea that you're going to have some sort of control over these guys, they couldn't even control Bacon's rebellion. And those people were just pressed up against the Appalachians right here with coastal elites right here. So for a lot of Americans, their problem with the Articles is they hate Virginia because Virginia is still stubbornly holding on to these claims, saying, maybe I'll just hold on to this, and this will be just kind of our super colony, and then eventually they back down, and other colonies will do the same. And so the reason why we taught you the Appalachian Mountains is this is going to create then an opening out west where all of this area will be given up by their mother colonies, and they'll be open up for exploration out west. So with this Confederacy, though, what we need to understand about the Articles of Confederation is it's only going to have one branch of government. And trust me, this is going to be key because we want to be able to compare and contrast the Articles today with the Constitution tomorrow and the next day. So in this, you've got one branch. It's a legislature, which is very similar to what was happening in the colonies with like the House of Burgesses. With this legislative branch, though, that's all they've got. They've got no presidency, so you'll have some people who will say to you that there was a president before George Washington, in fact, multiple. They were just the president or the leader of this Congress, which means they weren't really a president. They were just the president of this Congress leading it. So it's a fun trivia piece, but it's not something that's helpful. So we don't really have a president who's giving us leadership. We don't really have a federal court system. It's all being done by the states. And what that means is this Congress could pass laws, but without a president to enforce the laws and a court system to interpret the laws, you just pass a law and give it to the states, and then the states get to choose if they want to do the enforcement of that law. And if a state decides not to, they can just ignore all the laws. This is a radical's dream. So instead of having a king to boss you around with all of these taxes, they now get to say no to the government whenever they request stuff. Your problem, though, is if you have a battle going on in Virginia, and you've got a bunch of troops that are located in Delaware, and you ask them, can you please send your troops over to help defend the Virginians, the state of Delaware could say, even though it could be the meaning between victory or loss in the war, we're just going to keep our guys in our own state because they're ours. We can control them. And so this is going to create an anarchy where George Washington is working against all of this independent movement because he's not getting the support he needs to have a unified front against the British. Also, take a look at the Congress they create. On the surface, it sounds good. Every state's going to get one vote. The problem is you're allowed to send as many representatives as you want to the Congress, but your state will still only get one vote. So if you send 8 representatives from New York, all 8 of you need to agree on how you're voting. If one person says, no, I don't agree, then your vote just gets thrown out and it doesn't get counted. And so for these states, it's really hard to get a unified idea behind who the representative should be and what their voice should be saying. Notice also they don't just need a majority of the 13, they need a super majority of 9 out of 13 to pass any bill through Congress, like taxes or military or whatever. And since the Constitution that they have, their articles, says the government can't tax, they can't even do that with a super majority. They need to get a unanimous vote to get anything like that done. Getting a unanimous vote between northern and southern states on any issue is virtually impossible. And I'd like to give you the name of one state that I started off with about a month ago that I want to return you to. Remember Rhode Island? Little tiny Rhode Island, the gutter of New England, the sewer that they have up there. Started by Roger Williams, full of all this riffraff and troublemakers. Smallest colony that we have and smallest state size-wise, geographically. These guys love the fact that they hold power over the entire nation. And so when there's bills that come up and they're the vital vote, they love voting no, just to show everybody that Rhode Island can mess with everybody in the colonies and derail everything. And so Rhode Island is a thorn in their side because of this independent streak, and they just want to be radically independent
and left alone, no matter who is in control. So this Congress is a mess. They can't get anything done. And the reason why this is important to us is because of the fact that after the war is finished, we've got problems. We win the war, but keep in mind, victory means that the British just quit. It didn't mean that we actually crushed the British military. They aren't destroyed. They just decided to stop bleeding money and people into the 13 colonies. So as a result, we've still got an enemy in Britain who doesn't like us very much. But when the war is done, the only thing that had been uniting the colonies together was our hatred of England. And as soon as that war is over, we go back to hating each other and having that independence streak that stopped the Albany Congress from working 20 years past. So when we look at the Articles, there is no way to regulate trade. And so as a result, there's no way for them to be able to actually help the economy get started again. They also can't collect tax money. And so here's your list of enemies that I want to be noticing in Chapter 9. England hates us because we defeated them in the American Revolution and took their colonies away. France now hates us because we owe them tons of cash, but without being able to raise taxes, we can never repay them, and we froze them out of the treaty negotiations. Spain also lent America gigantic amounts of cash, and we can't repay them either because of the fact that we cannot enforce any sort of tax laws. So we have now managed to make every European colonizing country incredibly mad at the United States, even though we got our independence. For many of these countries, they believe that our country is going to disintegrate into anarchy pretty soon because this government's such a wreck. And so they believe that they're eventually going to be able to come in and peel off chunks. The Spanish are thinking maybe they could expand Florida into like Georgia and the Carolinas as those places disintegrate. Or Canada, with their English ownership, is thinking about what they can do with New England. When they take a look at these colonies also, this is a confederacy, which means the states have all the power, and so they cannot force the states to do anything they do not want to do. This Articles of Confederation government, then, is very weak. It's our first attempt at trying out a new government, and like my friend who went off to college, he found out that this is something where he went a little bit too far, and the Constitution will then dial things back. There is a big accomplishment that is created by the Articles of Confederation, though. So this is what I would like you to dial into when you're taking a look at the Articles of Confederation. They have a lot of Western land to deal with, and so this very weak government realizes that they need to figure out something systematically to help create new states out of the territories that are out in the West, especially in the Ohio River Valley. And when I show you the map that is up here, what I want to consider is the fact that when the war was done, we were surrounded by enemies who didn't like us very much. We had the British to the north, the Spanish to the south, Indians in the Ohio River Valley. And so what the Americans decide is they need to fill this space up with Americans so that we're able to claim this territory, perhaps not by our military, but instead by expansion. So let me give you the two major accomplishments that are done with the Articles of Confederation to deal with problems. The rest of what it's up to is largely a failure. Number one is the Land Ordinance of 1785, and deals with what's known as the Old Northwest. And so the Old Northwest that they're talking about is like the Ohio River Valley, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and those sorts of places. What they're going to do with the Land Ordinance is they're going to try to figure out how to carve up this western area as quickly as they possibly can. Using surveyors, they're going to divide up the land into surveyed chunks. So they're going to divide up, here's Indiana, here's Ohio, and rough out what the territories look like. What they're also going to be doing then is they're going to be dividing this up into grids. And this is what's going to hurt Native Americans' attempts to resist American movement out to the western frontier. By building these grids, what they're going to be able to do is they're going to allow people who are immigrants to land in places like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and they will be able to, without ever seeing this land, read a description of the place. And so they might read that in this section that you see right here, section number 14 might have a little stream running through it and a tree and something like that, and they might decide sight unseen to buy that land as their new farmland. You're going to then have waves of settlers coming into this area where there are Indians still living, but the Indians are going to be facing hundreds of white people with papers that say they have deed to the land, and they'll start settling down and farming. If the Indians try to stop that, they're going to get killed or driven away by the United States military because they've now claimed this property. Does that make sense? Also, one of the legacies that's going to be moving forward is the idea of public schools. And so that idea from New England is going to take off throughout the northern part of the United States. So where you're living in Minnesota has a heavy New England puritanical influence, all the way down to the fact that your city of Plymouth has all sorts of street names and all sorts of things that you see from the Revolutionary era. And so when we take a look at this map, there will always be a section set aside to build a public school. And so that becomes a huge thing throughout all the North. You're going to have then a literacy gap start emerging, because in the South, you don't build a public school in a place where there is no town. So you're going to have a bunch of towns throughout northern parts of the United States where they're farming with centralized towns where they can do trade. But in the South, they're largely going to start growing not just tobacco, but after the cotton gin, they're going to start growing cotton. And so that's going to be our difference that we see emerging with these guys. The second act that is important is known as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. These two should be seen together. So the land ordinance is dividing up the land out west into grids, so you can easily buy land and move out west. The Northwest Ordinance is instead taking a look at this area and figuring out how do we then take these people and make them United States citizens so they have a reason to move out west. Because if they move out west in the wild and they're not Americans anymore, then they're going to feel like they're outsiders, kind of like the colonists did during the Revolution. So what they said is if you move into American territory out west, you still retain the rights of being citizens. That's first and foremost. Secondarily, they set up rules then for how we could create new states. And these new states are not going to be disadvantaged states. It's not going to be like Virginia Supreme and then Minnesota is inferior. We're going to create rules to add new states so they become equals with the original 13 as they enter into the United States. Go ahead, Olivia.
So for like the people moving out west, was it like immigrants coming in, or like people like moving their whole farms over out west?
Both. So when we take a look at the rules that we have here with the Northwest Ordinance, they're very simple. Once you hit a certain population threshold, you get to become a territory. And once you become a territory, you then have the right to be able to have official representation with the government, to be able to negotiate and talk to them. You can set up a territorial government, and you could then be officially part of the United States as an organized territory, yeah.
So when would like other states start coming in, like as official states?
No. So that's what I was about to get to in just a second. Once you get to 60,000 people living inside the territory that you've established, that's when you could apply for statehood. And once you applied for statehood and got admitted, you would then be able to add people to Congress, so they'd be able to join the Articles of Confederation Congress, have their one vote like everybody else, and then you'd be an equal to everybody else. So you're going to see now a lot of states start getting added, like Ohio and Indiana, as people start moving into that territory. One big key takeaway that I want you to notice, though, and this is going to be key coming up in future chapters, although for these guys, they didn't realize how important this was, is you need to understand why there's controversy going on with the statute debate that we just had about a month ago. So about a month ago in Chancellorsville, there was a debate, should we leave up Robert E. Lee statues of the Confederate generals who fought during the Civil War? And when they started taking these statues down, Donald Trump asked the question if we should possibly think about then taking down George Washington or Thomas Jefferson statues, because they all owned slaves, and he was trying to ask, is this how far that political correctness is going to go? In many of our minds, though, there's a difference between Robert E. Lee and what he was doing to defend slavery compared to like a George Washington or the people during this time period. I'd like to give you a term that makes it a lot more complicated when you look at a guy like George Washington. Washington had a huge plantation, made massive sums of money off of it, but he believed that slavery was dying out. So when he died in 1799, he was pretty certain that slavery was on its end legs because tobacco farming was so bad for the soil that it was destroying farms all throughout Virginia. He also felt that slavery wasn't compatible with the Declaration of Independence for his fight in the Revolution. So let me give you a term. He believed in something called manumission, and it's just like it sounds, M-A-N-U, mission. So man, the letter U, mission. It became the style of the time for people who were enlightened, like George Washington, to free their slaves on their deathbed in their wills, so that once he and his wife passed away, all the slaves would be given their freedom because that wasn't compatible with the Declaration of Independence. For many people, that action is not fast enough to redeem George Washington, and they don't feel like statues of him should stay up, and that's a totally legitimate historical perspective to take. But for Washington and the Founding Fathers, they're going to be throwing a curveball in the late 1700s because most of them are of the mindset that slavery is on the path of destruction because of how bad it is for the soil. And so you could see that playing out here with the last passage of the Northwest Ordinance, which is something that's kind of weird. This government that is so weak, that is so timid about telling anybody anything that they're not allowed to do, they pass a message that says even with their weak government, they're going to choose places in the United States where you cannot have slavery. This is going to have a huge legacy. So when you have Southerners towards the 1800s who start saying the government can't tell us what we can or can't do with the slaves, you've got Founding Fathers here who are saying, oh yes we can, we're telling you you can't have slaves here. This is all going to get messed up though by the cotton gin in the 1790s. And so when slavery is on the path to destruction, when the cotton gin shows up, then slavery is going to boom again, and it's going to throw a monkey wrench into everything. Go ahead.
So manumission was just like once slave owners died, the slaves would be set free?
Correct.
Okay.
So if you could please, what I would like you to do is I would like you to explain to your neighbors then the two different things you saw here, the Land Ordinance of 1785, Northwest Ordinance of 1787, and see if you could run through the steps of how they're now clarifying westward expansion and how statehood works.
Why was it Virginia?
All right, you guys have any questions about those two laws? Sweet. So, go ahead. Hit it.
Why wasn't Virginia the first state that was like?
I'm not sure which time period you're referring to. Are you talking about like with the Constitution like ratifying it?
Well,
or
you
what do
know,
mean?
like how Minnesota was like officially a state in like 18 something. Like,
Yeah.
why wasn't Virginia? If it was like Delaware was the first state, you know? Yeah. So like why Twitter and like?
I think it might have to do with the ratification of the Constitution, but I'm not sure. That'd be a really good Google search, but I don't know the answer. Olivia?
So you said how like if Indians were living in the West Square
Mhm.
and like Americans came in, they would like kick them out, like the British or the military would come in.
Mhm.
But I thought you said earlier that the Articles of the Confederation said there was like no official military.
So you're going to see at the end of the Revolution, while there isn't like an ability for them to mobilize an army on their own after the war is done, they're still the ones who are helping to direct what's happening with like the Continental Army that's fighting during the Revolutionary War. It's just once the war's finished, they then have lots of problems to be able to mobilize that again once they demobilize. So I should have been much more clear that there's a difference between when the war's running and the Second Continental Congress is in effect. Because when this happens, this is 1781 when it finally becomes official, and then they see their powers reduced once they move from wartime to peacetime. So here's your issues that you're going to run into. America's got tons of problems. We want to run through these lists today to understand what's going wrong with the Articles of Confederation then. For the Articles of Confederation, nobody likes or respects the United States then because they're essentially an anarchy. You've got a confederacy, which means the central government has virtually no power. And so when America asks England, are you going to send a minister to our country so we can negotiate with you? England's like, who should I send him to? Should I send him to like your government that has no power? Or should I send them to Virginia or Massachusetts? Or how about I just ignore you guys and wait for you guys to fall apart, and then we'll just pick up the pieces? And so there's no respect coming from England. England is also going to point out to the Americans, you wanted independence? Great, you got it. The Navigation Acts are still in effect, which means English people are only allowed to trade with English people, and you're not that anymore. And so you're frozen out of the English markets and all of our colonies, and so you get to figure out who you're going to trade with, but it's not us. Also, they had been protected by the British Navy, but now they're the target of attack from the British Navy, because even though they've got a treaty, that doesn't mean that you've got safety to go wherever you want to in the ocean. You now are just a vulnerable, neutral country that has managed to make the biggest country on the planet really angry with the largest navy. You've also got problems going on where there are hopes of people possibly coming from Canada to take over chunks of the United States. The British are going to keep trading posts and forts operating in American territory, even though the Treaty of Paris said they'd get rid of them. The British just wait around to see if the Americans actually will show up with a military to force them out. And when they don't, they're like, I guess I'll just stay in this fort. It'll be fine. And so the Americans have really no power to force them out. They also have a problem with the Spanish. And the Spanish are going to be a huge threat for them because the Spanish lend the Americans a lot of materials, lots of money, and then the Americans can't repay them because they don't have power to raise taxes. So as a result, the Spanish are going to realize that they could then bully the United States and possibly take over chunks or all of their territories. Most important for this whole chapter with the Spanish is New Orleans. And so you want to make sure you're highlighting that when it comes to Spanish problems that are going on with the United States. You remember from your geography quiz, we love the Ohio River Valley. It connects with the Mississippi River, and then it empties in the Gulf of Mexico through New Orleans. The Spanish owning New Orleans means that if the Americans are stupid enough to send any boats downriver to try to ship stuff off to Europe, they can just capture those boats, steal American stuff, and then they can get rich off the American farmers without doing any of the work themselves. For the Americans, when they want to get the Mississippi River opened up, the Spanish say, nah, I don't think we're going to do that because what are you going to offer to us? And so America was too weak with this government to really threaten any of their neighbors to get things open. The other thing to notice is that the Indians have now realized the colonists are not their friends. They realize that if the colonists win, then the Native Americans are going to be in huge jeopardy out west. And so we're going to find that the Native Americans are going to be allying with the Spanish, with the British, in that middle ground that we talked about, to try to preserve their well-being, because as they watch, the Northwest Ordinance is essentially saying they're going to carve up this area and drive out all the Native Americans. And so the threat is real out in the western frontier, and these Indians are being egged on by the British and Spanish to harass the Americans just to make their lives even more miserable. We're also going to find that France is really angry because France was the ones who helped us win the war, and then you read in the Treaty of Paris, end of chapter 8, is really fun for a moment if you want to stick your thumb in the eye of France, where it's like, you got nothing in the Treaty of Paris, but now we've managed to make angry the third of all the colonial powers. Because we didn't give them anything, they have the second biggest navy in the world. They've got a gigantic military. They're the only reason why we're able to actually win in the Revolutionary War, and we've now made them mad. So we made the French, the Spanish, and the British all mad at us, and we've got independence, but we've got no unity, and so we're starting to fall apart. We're lacking respect so much that there are even pirates in the Mediterranean Ocean, Mediterranean Sea, who are going to be capturing our ships, stealing our sailors, holding them for ransom, and we can't do anything to them because our articles are too weak to even mobilize a response to deal with those guys. So this is your issue that you're running into, where we've got now big problems going on inside of our country, and I didn't even talk to you about what's happening inside of our country itself. Remember those soldiers who fought in the Revolutionary War? Those guys went through Valley Forge. They didn't get paid. They didn't get supplies. They had to sacrifice years of their lives to fight and win this revolution. They were promised that they would get paid later, but the article can't raise taxes, so none of these guys are getting paid. Many of them bought war bonds, so they actually gave loans to the government because they believed in independence so much, and those haven't been repaid. After the war is done, a bunch of bankers are going to start going out through the back country and foreclosing on these farmers. These are the revolutionaries who won the war for us. They're now going to start losing their farms because they have not been paid, and they lost all those years fighting for independence. When that starts happening, that's going to be Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. This farmer who was a revolutionary will pick up his gun like a good militiaman will, but instead of defending his territory, he's defending his farm, and he's rallying all the other patriots in the area to fight back against both the bankers and the politicians who are trying to steal his stuff. And it's at this moment when all the rich people realize there's tons of people like Daniel Shays around who can do the same thing in their colonies. So it's at this moment that people start thinking maybe we should move away from this weak Articles of Confederation, which isn't working out so great because it's got no power to do anything, and maybe we should come back to a constitution where we have more power in the federal government to fix our problems, but then we should also build in safeguards to make sure it doesn't turn into a dictatorship. Does that make sense? That's the first half of chapter 9. For a lot of kids, this can be confusing, so I covered it in one day, but thankfully because there's PSAC kids who aren't here, this is recorded for you. So if you need to check this out later, feel free to do so. Questions are also totally appropriate. So when you come to class tomorrow, it's Constitution Day. We'll take the day to then work through what does that new government look like compared to the old government. Any questions? Awesome.